Thanks. Thanks, Jen. So, I'm going to hold my breath. No, that would be a really boring start to the talk. I'm one of the luckiest people around for many reasons, but one of them was I fell into a profession, which is teaching, that I love tremendously, and that's driven a lot of my professional work. I now run a technology company called Achievery that builds digital credentials that helps verify skills that are gained anywhere. You can think briefly about a credential like a digital diploma, except you can click down onto it, it verifies itself, and you can see evidence underneath of what it represents. And my work connects me with amazing institutions around the world that are tackling a very big question. How do you really know what someone can do? And if you've ever hired anybody or had to apply for a job, you know it's a big challenge to make the right hire. You know it's hard to get together the type of evidence you need to present your work in such a way that you could get hired. And what I can tell you right now, because we're seeing these get built on our platform today, is that there are new credentials and new solutions that are proving what people can do, and it looks very different. And I'm going to talk about that today. These credentials are going to be knocking some of the most elite credentials and diplomas in the world off their pedestal. This was a photo of myself in my first year teaching, and I'm going to start the story there. Because in my first year, I was in California, and I was walking into my first parent-teacher conferences. And at the same time, for a couple months while I was teaching at a 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, as a 6th, 7th, and 8th grade math and science teacher, I was also working in the maximum security section of the Santa Clara County Juvenile Detention Center. And it was scary times in California. They had just passed a 3 strikes law, which meant that they were sending teenagers to prison for the rest of their life when they got a third infraction and had a previous felony with a weapon. And the kids I saw in the evening were very similar to the kids I saw during the day. And anyway, so I'm starting my parent-teacher conferences, and anyone that's been through them knows there's some tough ones, and there's some easy ones. And my parents are in the crowd. I wonder what they're thinking. I have a feeling I gave them a couple tough ones when I was growing up. But this was a tough one. I had a student as an 8th grader who, by all the metrics that we had in school, was failing. He was failing his classes. He had a lot of behavioral infractions. He had a tough time focusing. But as a first-year teacher, I really wanted to start with the strength of a student, and I wanted to make a connection and create a relationship with their parents. And so I started talking with his mother, and I said, Carlos spends a lot of time in my class after class, and he draws a lot. And she said, I see him drawing at home as well. And I said, I draw a lot. I studied studio art for a time in college. He's very good, and he's particularly good in his use of color. And she started crying. And she said, he's an 8th grader. That might be the first positive thing a teacher has told me about my son. And the fact is, our schools take a very thin sliver of human intelligence, and they define kids by it, and we cause irreparable damage because of it. I was back that same week in the Juvenile Detention Center, and I was working with the Stanford Street Law program, which brought law students into the prisons to help discuss the implications of why someone was in there. And for the first time, a 16-year-old truly understood that he was going to spend the rest of his time in prison. When we don't recognize the dynamic intelligence behind humans, we cause a lot of damage. Now, traditional education's looked very similar for the last 100 years, right? The content and curriculum that I had in high school is fairly similar to the stuff my parents had in the 40s and 50s. There were 2 differences. One was, I think, Latin and Greek was required at the time. The other was, this is more to do with my father, who was a bit of a troublemaker. The difference being that he just spent a lot more time in detention than I did. But we took the same tests, and we on the same type of content and curriculum. If you passed, you got a diploma, which communicated very little about your actual skills. You know, my two daughters will find my paper diploma very funny. They'll say, "Dad, there's no information in it. I can't click and see what this represents." Their friends will tell Yo Daddy jokes. Your daddy is so old, his diploma is a piece of paper. They'll say he's probably so old he used the phone that used to be plugged into a wall. But I have a joke on them, of course, because I'm so old. I was able to go to high school and college before Facebook. Thank goodness. We have self-written resumes. These will be a thing of the past shortly, because we still have CEOs who write their own resumes and sometimes write them a little too well. The CEO of Yahoo 2 years ago had to step down. Just this week, top executive at Walmart, who just said he had a degree that he didn't have. We have validated assessments, which are very good at describing a very thin slice of a specific content or skill, but these come as pieces of paper often, and they're tough to verify. I like the endorsements. These are a fun one. We have people in this room, and you can probably see some of them right here, that have endorsed me for curriculum design but have never observed me teaching. They've never looked at a lesson plan. Now, LinkedIn gets all the data, and it helps them generate a lot of revenue. But they are onto something. It has to do with our social graph and how it can point to indicators of success further on. And when you have a robust social graph, that often helps in the future. It's why dentists' kids that are graduating from the big picture schools often do quite well, because they spend years in internships, building relationships with adults in the community and mentors. This is my wife's LinkedIn endorsement. So no one is going to mistake me for the photographer in the family. So there is some interesting things happening here. Even though these are unverifiable data points, they do start collecting an interesting picture. So this space is changing very fast. And here's why. Right? What's happening now in education, our biggest cities, our school systems often see a 50% dropout rate. Of those that start going to a 4-year college, 50% of them don't finish in 6 years. The ones that do, half of those are either underemployed or require more skills training because the education they just finished didn't prepare them for the workforce. Okay, and by the way, college debt surpassed credit card debt 4 years ago, which is why it's no surprise that people like Clay Christensen say that in 14 years, half of all of our universities may be bankrupt. The reality is there's more places now where you can learn anytime, anywhere, and anyhow. We are going from K-8 to high school to college to a situation where that's getting unbundled, right? And now I am getting shorter-term, stackable credentials that are proving my abilities in very different forms, and I want to talk about some of them. You know, 3 years ago, there was no such thing as a massive open online course, what are referred to as MOOCs. And now tens of millions of people every single month are on these platforms, gaining access to free online content. There are some healthy critiques of how the MOOCs are working now. In many ways, they are replicating the professor at the front of the room, the content going out in one direction. But I can tell you they're getting better fairly quickly, and they're a prominent example of how learning now happens anytime and anywhere. Stack Overflow is an interesting site. This is a place where web developers, it's simply a question and answer forum, where web developers can go if they are having trouble figuring something out and ask a question. And anyone in that community and that platform can answer it. And anyone can rate that answer. And what happens, as you might imagine, if my answers are getting a couple votes, yeah, that's not a bad answer, but a lot that are saying that's not actually that great, and someone else has an answer and 900 people go, that's it. And more answers are getting up there on the site. Well, it's a very good way of understanding who the expert is in the room. And these guys have done something fairly interesting because they now have all this data, and they also created like a badging system that's recognizing other behaviors they want to see to create a more valuable community. And they said, we're going to give you all a profile that gives you that data. And this has become one of the top destinations in the world to go hire a web developer right now, called Careers 2.0. And the interesting thing here is you can see the information that's been connected from this person's profile. And he can upload and say which college he went to and what degree he had. The interesting thing, though, is that no longer is at the top of his profile. It's at the bottom. And that the data that they're generating in terms of answering good questions has become more valuable to an employer. I'll go back. There's some very interesting regional examples where statewide departments of education are starting to mandate flexible credit pathways, right, which are providing very unique ways for students to show and demonstrate their proficiency outside the classroom. RIDE is one of them, in New Hampshire and Vermont and Ohio. And this is really pointing the arrow towards the future, where we're recognizing that skills can come from anywhere. Model United Nations is one of the largest learning programs in the entire world, and they have an online Model UN that is on our platform. And they are training students from around the world to become delegates of their countries, and they are trained in debate, and they do the same debates that the United Nations delegates do at The Hague, and some of them travel to The Hague and they do it. And they said a couple years ago, we've been writing this in on our college applications and our resumes. We want better proof of this incredible training we've gotten. And so the woman that runs it got in contact with us, and they've created 20 digital badges that are connected to the training that they get. And you can now click down on the badge and open up evidence like the actual debate you're seeing. So this is a big shift from the small amount of information you're getting out of a school or a diploma into incredibly robust evidence repositories about what people can really do. Udacity is one of the large MOOC platforms, and they are now offering a nano degree. Again, short-term course that they can stack together and create very unique sort of nano degrees, as they're calling them. They're doing this and they're co-developing these courses with employers who are then guaranteeing that they will hire a certain percentage of the people that successfully complete it, because they know this degree is something that they can understand and is offering the most current skills out there. This is a group that we came across on our platform, Mouse, that trains high school and middle school students in information technology, computer repair, robotics. Many of these students become the de facto IT departments in their school systems. They're around the country. And they have another program, Mouse Core. And in this program, they're using, they're designing technological solutions for different types of communities. And they are going after something that's fairly difficult to capture, which is the soft skills, which, as we know, is really the hard skills and the employable skills. And what does an empathy badge actually even mean? So they've partnered with the Cerebral Palsy Association, and they go in and they spend weeks and they wrap the students' hands up so they start understanding some of the challenges these folks are having. And it was interesting that I started talking about Carlos with his interest in drawing and in color, because one of the people they worked with was a painter, and she had trouble, the cerebral palsy, it challenged her to mix new colors and make new paints. And so they came in and listened and went back and prototyped some designs and tried to figure out a solution for her. And she said, no, you weren't quite hearing me. And actually what you've done, I can't move my arm in that way, and can we go back? And they're listening, and they're becoming empathetic. And they are tracking that evidence in that process, Mouse is, throughout those weeks. This space for us is fascinating. I have a ton of things that I'm interested in looking at. One of them is simply, what are the next big data sets out there that are going to start to be a high signal for success? Would it be baking together a social graph with some pieces of evidence of what I've done in high school? What does a future-facing credential look like? Or a living credential. For instance, if I graduate from high school, it doesn't just say what I did, but what I want to do. Would you be more interested in accepting me to college if my high school diploma was a question that I want answered and people I wanted to work with and evidence of things I had built in and outside of my school versus, say, just my GPA. Because what I would love to have been able to do is go back to Carlos as a veteran teacher, right, and take his interests and skills and blend them into the science curriculum I was delivering around maybe electromagnetic radiation. Because what I know, and I think we all know, is that until our institutions, our training schools that are training our youth and our future workforce get better at understanding and recognizing the complex beauty of human intelligence, then we're going to continue to diminish and discredit the real potential capabilities of all of us. Thank you.